We're back live at the International Spy Museum in downtown Washington, D.C., about a block from the FBI building. And joining us now is Antonio Mendez, who is former chief of disguise for the CIA and the author of a couple of books, The Master of Disguise and also Spy Dust. Mr. Mendez, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What is the job of the chief of disguise for the CIA?
Well, I must also add that the second book was co-authored with my wife and I, and she was also chief of disguise. So you're getting a twofer here, even though she's not here. She's present with the book. In any case, the chief of disguise is in charge of one of the technical operations activities of the CIA on the clandestine side, obviously. It's not the sort of thing you use up on the Hill, for instance. But in the field, in order to run operations securely, you need to be able to cloak your operatives, and that would be the officers like Peter Ernest who are in the field under some sort of cover. If they've got to go out and meet a source, a lot of times you're disguising the officer and perhaps the source for some reason, but typically it's so that you can secure operations.
Well, we just had Peter Ernest on the set. What would you do to change his appearance?
Well, obviously Peter is rather dapper and well-groomed and official-looking. If he were in the field, he might be in some official capacity for the United States. And then when he went clandestine, he would have to go out on the streets and blend in. So what you do is you look at what he is and then try to figure out how to change each one of those things that he is that are recognizable. In other words, just sort of take it as a list of things to work on, like maybe his height, maybe his weight, maybe his hair coloring, and that sort of thing. Even his sex, you know.
You can change the sex of a person.
Well, sometimes you have to do that. Yeah.
Well, I want to let viewers know the numbers are on the screen. We want you to call in. We're just going to continue our conversation here. And we're looking at an exhibit over here that you developed, correct? What is this that we're seeing, the three?
Well, yeah, what the idea here is we take a person who was a curator for the museum, helped build the exhibits and so forth. She had a certain style, a certain pattern, and what we did is took three different personas to convert her to, and the exhibit shows the steps that one would take to do that. But each one of those personas would have a reason. You don't do disguise in a vacuum. It has to have context. In other words, where you see the street person there, you might want that person to do surveillance on the street. That's a good disguise for staying out on the street for some time. If you have sort of staked out a certain street corner, as street people do, you would have stability. Of course, we did change her sex there, too.
And that's the same woman?
That's the same woman.
Right there?
Yes, exactly. And we changed her a couple other ways there, too, as you see. And there are reasons for each one of those.
Now, are you giving away state secrets by telling us all this?
No, actually, what we're looking at here is what we'd call commercially available techniques. And what people like or organizations like the CIA do is they build on commercial capabilities and refine them to whatever degree necessary in order to meet the requirement. So what you're seeing in this display is what would be 1970s Hollywood techniques. And what I was credited for doing as chief of disguise, and then those who came after me, was to make those techniques even better. And so you have to sort of imagine how good you can get by throwing a lot of time and money and talent at a technique if it's necessary.
202-585-3880 if you're a Republican, 202-585-3881 for Democrats, and 202-585-3882 for all others. We'll begin taking your calls right away. Mr. Mendez, you've disguised yourself before.
Oh,
Is
yes.
that correct?
One of the things that a disguise officer has to be able to do is recommend things that'll work, and so a fundamental part of that process is to have done it all yourself, and so you kind of become to the customer, if you want to call him that, as an expert. And then, of course, you don't do your work in a vacuum or in a laboratory in Washington either. You do it in the field. So a lot of times you have to disguise yourself in order to get to the source that you're trying to disguise. For instance, the the business of rescuing the six from Iran, I was the one who went in to disguise and document them because I was the expert. Of course, I had to have a disguise and a document to get there.
Well, let's go back. I know that according to your bio that you conducted the secret rescue of the diplomats in 1979 from Tehran. You disguised them as what? As Canadians?
Hollywood film crew, a multinational film crew. I was a European, they were Canadians, but they each had a job that related to location scouting for a Hollywood production. So we had to create a production company, you know, go out, find the real estate, get people to man the real estate, go to the Hollywood trade newspapers and take out ads for our movie. This is what we call backstopping a cover. So we made this elaborate backstopping so that if somebody were to challenge them as they were trying to leave Iran, they could verify, in fact, that these were real people. So that's part of the disguise, if you will. It's actually stage management.
And you got into Tehran. How did you get into Tehran?
Well, it was part of the cover story, part of the cover legend. I went there to meet the rest of the crew, and I went there with another expert in exfiltration, which is what we call this kind of operation. He was the linguist, I was the artist, so to speak, and together we made the team that would bring them out. So he and I arrived ostensibly to meet them there for a meeting because we wanted to scout the bazaar. That was our cover story. We were doing this movie that needed a bazaar like that in Tehran. So in case somebody were to challenge us, they would say, you know, why here? And we'd say, well, look at here. Here's the script, and this is the place. But what we had to do is make it look like the other six that we were rescuing had arrived from the east. Hong Kong, as I recall, on Air France was the ostensible carrier, and we arrived from the west, Zurich, on Swiss Air. And we picked those flights because they arrived precisely at the same time. And if, in fact, they did arrive on the same time, we knew that the six would have come through the same immigration officer, got the same stamps and signatures that we did. That's what we call parallel probing. So we collected the intelligence we needed to finish off their documents. So it's all part of this whole business of disguise and deception and illusion that we're into.
So were you disguised at that point?
Yes, I was the production manager. And I had a certain nationality, a certain persona. I had an alias. In fact, there's a display in the museum of that verisimilitude, if you will, the pocket litter, the pieces that I carried, including the full-page ad in Variety, some of the other pieces, my business card, and so forth. So I had all the pocket litter. I had all the costume and the profile and pattern of this person that I had created. I had to get into that. That's a lot about what disguise is about, is getting into the role.
And the other six that you rescued?
Then I had to then coach each one of them in their cover. So we looked at their true bio and we matched their cover job to what their experiences were. So for instance, the set designer was Kathy Stafford, who had an art background. So when we arrived, we had the props for her, the sketch pads and set designs and so forth that she could use as part of her cover. And in my portfolio, which was an overt item we made up in order to conceal some of the clandestine things, I had the bios on each one of them as an overt part of my portfolio for the movie. And so then I could just tear that out and hand it to them and say, there's your story. Now learn that. You've got 2 days to learn this, and then you'll be tested on it by us in sort of a hostile interrogation before we go to the airport. And if you don't know every detail, then we will make sure that you do.
And were there problems?
Well, there were a few. One of the issues that those who made the decision to run this operation, or let me run this operation, were concerned with is, will all six be willing to do this? You know, because not everybody is into this kind of thing. And so there was varying kinds of response to my pitches to them, if you will. But in fact, as a group, we ended up creating a consensus, and we all came out okay. The other problems we had were, is this particular document still used? And if it is used, the way it's designed, could we get caught up in the airport and that sort of thing? So there's a little bit of worry about that sort of thing. But we ran a lot of intelligence gathering operations to make sure that was okay. Thirdly, we wanted to make sure that the airplane arrived, that it was going to leave, and that sort of thing. Those are sort of the fundamental things that you worry about. The worst thing that can happen is to get all 6 in the airport and there's no airplane, and you don't have, or your reservation isn't good. So you make sure you have all these logistical things in place. But once we got in through immigration, found that they weren't using that document the way it was designed, or they would have caught us. And we were in the departure lounge, and we had chosen Swiss Air because it had a good maintenance record, and it was on time and so forth. It was early in the morning because we didn't want a lot of people milling around the airport. All of a sudden, we've got a mechanical problem, and now we've got 6 people sitting in the departure lounge being scrutinized, and we're wondering how long is this going to take. So there's a lot of those cliffhangers, that you deal with. But ultimately, it worked. We were going up the ramp to the airplane. One of the 6 nudged me with his elbow, and he said, "You guys think of everything, don't you?" And he pointed to the nose of the airplane, and lettered across the nose of the airplane was the word Argo, which is a region in Switzerland. Well, the name of our movie was Argo, and it was so close. It was just one of those omens that you always look for in an operation of this sort. And once we saw that, we said, it's going to be okay, because we still had to leave around an airspace. Once you get on the airplane, you still have the problem of leaving their airspace.
First call up for Antonio Mendez, Worcester, Massachusetts. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm a criminal justice major at Westfield State College in Westfield, Mass. And this subject fascinates me. In point of fact, I never thought of this particular aspect of it. The professors talk to us more about they're needing more computer scientists to be able to decipher the codes, etc., and they need to have more money to teach the Middle Eastern languages. And the professor that taught me terrorism was recently called back into service because of this 911 thing for the next 2 years. And the aspect of a disguise hasn't been discussed that much in class, so this really interests me. And I really appreciate your coming on C-SPAN to discuss it, Mr. Mendez.
Well, thank you. Yeah, disguise is fundamental. It's probably the most used tradecraft of all, but it's sort of arcane too, and it's not sort of thing people really know about.
Next call, Boston. Good morning.
My question is, how is modern technology changing your job? I would think in some ways it's making it more difficult, in some ways it's easier. Thanks for C-SPAN.
Yes, there's always a trade-off between the progress of modern technology and the ability to use good and secure tradecraft. In the past, I might add, that during the Cold War, for instance, there was a lot of the intelligence organizations pushing technology, making the batteries smaller, more powerful, make the cameras, radios more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. Then all of a sudden, the commercial technology started overtaking us, and what that meant is that even the smallest intelligence organizations or counterintelligence organizations go out and acquire the same sort of level of technology we had. And that raised the threat. And of course, these days, with the internet and computer technology, et cetera, it's much harder to sustain, for instance, a cover. In other words, create a persona and have it withstand scrutiny, because it's so easy to check an identity by using modern technology. So there's always the trade-offs with technology. But it's my part of the business was in technical services, and we were always imagining new technology or seeing it in James Bond films or so forth, and we were always pushing the law of physics, if you will.
Okay, we've talked about Hollywood makeup, and I think that's what most people think of when they think of disguise and chief of disguise. Mm-hmm. What has changed? Can you give us any specific examples?
Well, that gets into the sources and methods of technology. What I can say is, if you look at the citation that was written about me on the 50th anniversary of the CIA. I was credited with pushing the technology of disguise so that that CIA officers could work more and more securely and more realistically in the most hostile places in the world. I would give you a timeline. I first got involved in 1971 while I was in the Far East, in South Asia. I did things out there in concert with technicians and researchers and Hollywood experts that led me to become chief of disguise by 1974. So that's, like in 3 years. By 1976, we rewrote the modus operandi for CIA in Moscow, which is, in those days, Wimbledon Center Court. And so we really changed the way that we could operate. And it was a lot about creating illusion and deception by using disguise and other techniques. So I'll be only that precise.
Fayetteville, North Carolina, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Ma'am, you got to turn down the volume on your TV, hit the mute button, and go ahead with your comment.
Hi, I work for Special Forces Command at Fort Bragg, and I've been studying the OSS, which is in our 50-year history of Special Forces. And in particular, I've been studying a man who named Leif Bangsball, who was operating immediately after World War II in Berlin. And I read a book about disguises at that time, and apparently, do you know anything about hazelnuts that you could drill a hole through and quickly shove them into your nose to create a whole different persona just by flattening your nose and that sort of thing? And did spies of this era and that era, did they carry on their person quick change type apparatuses?
What you're referring to is a technique that was in a OSS disguise manual that was written in 1944, and it was actually created by consultants in Hollywood for the OSS operatives who were serving behind enemy lines. They realized very quickly if they got in trouble, if their cover started to erode while they were in Fortress Europe or wherever, what they needed to do is be able to get away and change their look in order to escape and evade, as we would say. That's E&E, that's disguise for escape and evasion. And the hazelnut was one of the techniques that was in this manual. We couldn't send them a bunch of material because they couldn't conceal it or carry it with them. So what we had to do in this manual is tell them how to use found materials. The hazelnuts were to change the shape of your nose. And the idea was you drilled tiny holes through these hazelnuts so you could still breathe, but you had them in your pocket, a couple of hazelnuts with holes drilled through them, and you push them up your nose and you would change the shape of your nose. Actually, changing the shape of somebody's face is a game of millimeters, and a lot of times it's done from within. For instance, we make a device called a plumper that goes up under the lip or down along the gum line. And if you remember Marlon Brando, for instance, in Godfather, where he had an old man's chin like this, that was done with a plumper. So a lot of things are done within, some things are done on the outside. And the hazelnuts is part of that technique.
Fairfield, California, good morning.
Good morning.
You're on the air.
Yeah, this is Colette from Pytown, New Mexico.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was wondering, I purchased a book at a library sale called I Led 3 Lives by Herbert Philbrick. And I was wondering if you had any information. I remember my parents, when I was young, back in the early 50s, talking about this man, and I just wonder if you have any information on him and if the book is worth reading.
Antonio Mendez.
Well, yeah, I remember as a adolescent, the television show made on that book, I Led 3 Lives, and I watched it with interest because I was just becoming at the age where I started understanding about spies and counterspies. And Herbert Philbrick was an FBI counterspy agent, and what he was doing was infiltrating these groups that were considered to be a threat to our national security. These are like American Communist Party cells and so forth. But it was a very exciting, and probably one of the first things that I thought of was when it came to having an opportunity to become an intelligence officer. I must tell you, the thing that drew me into the CIA was the word intrigue. And I can tell you that every day that I was there, every day of 25 years that I was there, was as intriguing as you would expect. In fact, more intriguing than the James Bond films or the Mission Impossible shows. So this book would be worth reading, yes, because it's true.
Last call, McAllen, Texas. Good morning. McAllen, Texas, you there? We don't have our last call. McAllen?
Yes.
Last chance. Go ahead.
Okay, just two things. One, wanted to see if if I purchased copies of your books, where I might be able to get them signed to give out as a gift. And second comment is, I just visited the Spy Museum last week when I was there for a high school reunion, and it was fascinating, very impressive. But one of the questions I have is, have you ever had to use disguise for internal things such as Aldra James or Robert Hansen? And just curious as to how that's affecting those kinds of things when we have internal problems.
Well, in fact, the museum is intriguing as well, and I'm glad you liked it. As the question on where to get the books signed, I should mention that they're available on our website, themasterofdisguise.com. And in there's a block that you check for the inscription that you want. We even put one of our own custom designed book plates in it. But they are available at bookstores and online as well. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity to mention that. Finally, yes, disguises sometimes are used for what you might call internal purposes. In other words, if you've got a mole in your midst, you might use disguise as a way to find what they're up to.
And here, Mr. Mendez's two books, Spy Dust and The Master of Disguise. Did you need to get permission from the CIA to write some of the stuff in here that you did?
Absolutely. Submitted to the Publications Review Board of the CIA, and they work with you to make sure you don't have classified information in there. And sometimes it's a long process. I think collectively those two books have probably been reviewed 12 times, as I recall.
Antonio Mendez, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to the Spy Museum for letting us come over here this morning. We appreciate it very much. And tomorrow on the Washington Journal, we will be live from 7 to 10 a.m. We will be talking about the War Powers Act. And on Sunday, the German ambassador, Ambassador Ischinger, will be joining us to take your calls and to talk about U.S.-German relations and the whole situation with Iraq. Have a great Labor Day weekend. We'll see you tomorrow.
We did change her sex there, too.
And that's the same woman?
That's the same woman.
Right there?
Yes, exactly. And we changed her a couple other ways there, too, as you see. And there are reasons for each one of those.
Now, are you giving away state secrets by telling us all this?
No, actually, what we're looking at here is what we'd call commercially available techniques. And what people like or organizations like the CIA do is they build on commercial capabilities and refine them to whatever degree necessary in order to meet the requirement. So what you're seeing in this display is what would be 1970s Hollywood techniques. And what I was credited for doing as chief of disguise. Clandestine side, obviously. It's not the sort of thing you use up on the Hill, for instance. But in the field, in order to run operations securely, you need to be able to cloak your operatives, and that would be the officers like Peter Ernest who are in the field under some sort of cover. If they've got to go out and meet a source, a lot of times you're disguising the officer and perhaps the source for some reason, but typically it's so that you can secure operations.
Well, we just had Peter Ernest on the set. What would you do to change his appearance?
Well, obviously Peter is rather dapper and well groomed and official looking. If he were in the field, he might be in some officiator for the museum, help build the exhibits and so forth. She had a certain style, a certain pattern, and what we did is took 3 different personas to convert her to, and the exhibit shows the steps that one would take to do that. But each one of those personas would have a reason. You don't do disguise in a vacuum. It has to have context. In other words, where you see the street person there, you might want that person to do surveillance on the street. That's a good disguise for staying out on the street for some time. If you have sort of staked out a certain street corner, as street people do, you would have stability. Of course.
We're back live at the International Spy Museum in downtown Washington, D.C., about a block from the FBI building. And joining us now is Antonio Mendez, who is former chief of disguise for the CIA and the author of a couple of books, The Master of Disguise and also Spy Dust. Mr. Mendez, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What is the job of the chief of disguise for the CIA?
Well, I must also add that the second book was co-authored with my wife and I, and she was also chief of disguise. So you're getting a twofer here, even though she's not here. She's present with the book. In any case, the chief of disguise is in charge of one of the technical operations activities of the CIA on the clandestine capacity for the United States, and then when he went clandestine, he would have to go out on the streets and blend in. So what you do is you look at what he is and then try to figure out how to change each one of those things that he is that are recognizable. In other words, just sort of take it as a list of things to work on, like maybe his height, maybe his weight, maybe his hair coloring, and that sort of thing. Even his sex, you know.
You can change the sex of a person.
Well, sometimes you have to do that. You know?
Well, I want to let viewers know the numbers are on the screen. We want you to call in. We're just going to continue our conversation here. And we're looking at an exhibit over here that you developed, correct? What is this that we're seeing, the three?
Well, yeah,
women?
what the idea here is we take a person who was